We have talked about it a lot here on the podcast, and that is the impending, looming ballot initiative by Citizens Not Politicians. We held this little flowchart up, which is not little, right around 60 different steps that you have to take just to put together the new so-called Citizens Commission. This was a product of Ohio Politics Guru on Twitter. Guru, thank you for this. This is very interesting. Don't know who Guru is, but this is how it would work or potentially not work. As state auditor, you sit on the Redistricting Commission, part of the process that was passed by voters overwhelmingly, more than 70% of the vote back in 2015 and also 2018. What's your thoughts on this repeated attempt to try to reform what was already reformed by the voters?
Look, it's a horrible idea. I'll start out with that. When you try and take politics out of an inherently political process, you end up with worse problems. And this organization is not apolitical. It has a very clear political leftist bent. They're all funded by the same funders. They all have the same support. And because they're not putting elected officials on there, doesn't mean they're not putting political people on there. I ask a rhetorical question. Who wants to serve on a redistricting commission if you have no interest in politics or no interest in political outcomes? Good luck finding people who have that model. They're not going to go out and just draft people from the citizenry. So the people who are going to apply for those positions all have their own political leanings. And their rules have cut out most anybody who would have a knowledge of what the impacts and other impacts are outside of the political organizations that are going to be feeding people in the organization, like the League of Women Voters. And so that's part of the problem. But the bigger problem is how is this going to work and what is the outcome? This is a very narrowly tailored process to lead to progressive political outcomes. If you look at the states where something like this has been done, almost always the final outcome is more progressive elected officials and fewer conservatives. It is a political outcome that is designed to hurt Ohio.
And Michigan found that out on their own a few months ago by violating the Federal Voting Rights Act.
Yeah, one of the ways that this is designed, and again, Keith hit it on the head, that progressive left-leaning folks can get their people into office. One of those ways is to take a portion of an inner city urban district and sort of pinwheel it out into the suburbs, and the folks in the suburbs get elected. And inevitably what that leads to is African American legislators losing their seats. And all political parties are made up of various factions. And by and large, most African American legislators are socially conservative. We may not call them conservatives in terms of other things that they vote on, but that's where their position is. The folks doing this are not interested in their views. What they're interested in is their progressive leftist power that they will have. And so folks may say, well, that's just Huffman. He's been involved in this for a long time. This just happened in Michigan. Same plan, same map. The African-American legislators sued, saying this violated the 1964 Civil Rights Act, and they won. The federal court said, yes, you did. You'll be hearing from those people during this campaign and other folks. So this is never about fair maps. This is never about gerrymandering, except that we would like to gerrymander these maps so that we get what we want. It's really odd that the League of Women Voters is one of the groups pushing this, because they were one of the groups pushing the 2015 and 18 reforms, which we all endorsed and passed overwhelmingly. So it must be a new set of people in charge of the League of Women Voters. But the other interesting thing, the fascinating thing is, of course, the Supreme Court sort of blew this up, didn't allow it to go forward in 21 and 22. Once the Supreme Court did not interject in 23, this passed by a unanimous bipartisan vote on obviously a very hot political topic last year. Now, tell me anywhere in the United States where that has happened on such a topic, and it hasn't. So
the president's right. Under the rules, if not implemented or interfered with by a clearly activist former Supreme Court, you would have had agreement and you would have had a deal. When we came at it, unfortunately, they were crazy enough to pick me as the chairman. We got a 7-0 vote. And we got a 7-0 vote because everybody understood the risk, like the current constitutional provisions require. Everybody has to manage risk. But if you recall, during the first version of the redistricting attempts, the ones that went back and forth to the court, it was very clear that the Supreme Court at the time, the majority of the court, led by the lady who's pushing this, clearly said, until the Democrats sign off on it, we're not going to give anybody what they want, and we're going to continue to keep this active in the courts. That was clearly the impression everybody
And that's not
had.
what the law says.
It is not. There is a very clear provision that look, they had the right to interpret it. They did. I think they got it wrong. I have the right to say I think they got it wrong. Having said all of that, it was amazing. Once the allied liberal groups and their friends thought that they weren't guaranteed an outcome from the Supreme Court to challenge until the cows come home, well, we had compromise. And that's what the process was originally envisioned to do, is to give everybody a right to have risk. And when you negotiate with risk involved, you tend to get a compromise. When people view the risk of saying yes outweighed by the benefits of saying no, you almost always get people saying no for political reasons or for whatever the thing is. And we had that directly. I was told by Democrats on the Redistricting Commission, and I said this in my deposition, we won't agree to a negotiated outcome as long as X or Y. And that is the circumstance that leads to them wanting a court challenge. They thought they would do better in the courts no matter what the deal was.
It's amazing when the NDRC, the fair districts groups, or as I like to call them, the unfair districts groups, and the League of Liberal Misinformation were removed from the process and let the commission actually do the work. 7-0 vote that produced the most compact maps in really the history of Ohio.
Yeah, not only the maps were more compact, it's easier to govern. Those were the things that we put in the 2015 reform, which dealt with the General Assembly. We're not dividing up communities. We don't have elongated districts. And really most of state government is administered at the county or local level. And that's why it's easier to know who your state rep or state senator is. That was part of the importance of the 2015 reform. The 2018 reform was the congressional reform. And of course, the map we passed pursuant to that constitutional process, that ultimately was appealed to the Supreme Court by these leftist groups. Now, once the court decided the North Carolina case and said, no, the states can do that, they can take politics in, that case was remanded back to the Ohio Supreme Court in 23 to say, read what we said in North Carolina. You redecide what we said under the previous Supreme Court.
In other words, you got it wrong.
You got it wrong, and so look at this and make a decision. Well, what did the leftist groups do? They dismissed the case. And the reason they gave for that is, well, we think there's been enough litigation. That's ridiculous. They dismissed the case on the congressional redistricting because they were going to lose. And so the answer is, if we want voters and their elected officials to make decisions versus judges, which is to make these political and policy decisions, then we have to let them do it. Otherwise, somebody in a robe someplace is going to make all your decisions for you.
And I thought it was very interesting, too, that regarding the maps for the General Assembly, the federal court, I believe was on page 78, and it's fairly easy to find, talked about the 4-3 majority at the time basing its ruling on standards, quote, not easily found anywhere in the Constitution. Translated, it's not found in the Constitution anywhere.
Look, when we pushed and the voters approved, and both President Huffman and myself were involved in drafting these provisions, when we did those things, our fundamental, overarching, bipartisan, fundamental basis for putting that in the Constitution and our overarching guidelines were really this. We wanted compact districts that allowed people to be represented by people who they knew and trusted. If you go to hub and spoke districts like President Huffman mentioned, which is what this proposal calls for, so that you can get a desired political outcome, that's called gerrymandering. And ultimately, the proposal that's in law now limits your ability to do that. It requires you to keep communities together, to draw compact districts, and that's going to allow people to be represented by people who share their interests and values. That's the current system. The new system will give you some kind of a political outcome to balance, and it's going to have people represented by people who have no idea how they can share their beliefs and values, because candidly, you're going for a political outcome. You're not going for community representation and keeping things compact.
Right, and the short version of that is have the court draw the map. Recently, the head of the League of Women Voters in Ohio was on the Then What Happened podcast from the Columbus Dispatch. It was an interesting conversation. Jen Miller said the following, quote, "But at the end of the day, there was no ability, no explicit ability for the Supreme Court to draw their own maps or get their own special mapping masters. We have that now." And she's referring to this flow chart. Basically, having the court draw the maps through the whole process and then rule on said map. Why would the General Assembly, a separate branch of government, ever want the judicial branch to legislate what the political districts would be for the General Assembly? Isn't that judicial activism? Why would the judiciary be involved in legislating maps for the GA?
And when that person says there's no explicit authority to them to do that, there is an explicit ban on the Supreme Court doing that. Constitutional reforms that were put in 2015 said the Supreme Court shall not draw any map or district. And that was specifically part of the reform. And of course, lots of states, those kinds of things were happening. They'd go up to the U.S. Supreme Court. We wanted to make that clear. And one of the reasons that was important is what Keith just mentioned. The people at the table had a series of incentives and penalties, both the majority and minority under the current system. And essentially, we had folks sitting around the table saying, well, in the past, 2010 and 2010 and 2000, Republicans could just say, here's the map, we followed civil rights, federal law, we're going to do what we want. In 1990 and 1980 and 1970, that was the Democrats doing the same thing. The new program said, look, it's probably better for us to give the minority somewhat what they want. And the minority party, who always voted no, well, if we do some of the things the majority, we can vote yes. It was the compromise, it was the working together that everybody says they want, but ultimately when it happens, folks like this are saying, give me more of what I want and less of a compromised, let's all talk about it together situation.
This concept of representational fairness is a nebulous concept. It's always a shifting goal, and it's what you want under the terms to meet your own political agenda, and that's why it doesn't work. And if you go back to the fundamental truism that in Ohio, people want to be represented by people who share their values and share their beliefs. And in Ohio, for the most part, people tend to live around people who think and vote like them. And if you want to divide that up to hit some political statewide proportionality, you're, by the very, very nature of that, going to have an awful lot of people in Ohio represented by somebody who doesn't share their thoughts and beliefs. And that's the outcome of this proposal.
And as I think the president said in an earlier podcast, the legislature doesn't tell the judicial branch how to rule on cases.
Well, yeah, I had some folks say, well, hey, when the Supreme Court ordered the Redistricting Commission, and by the way, we tried several times and did meet what they did, even though we're not required to do that, but ultimately would not pass a map, which apparently they needed to have. Well, that's a little bit like the legislature passing a law that says, Supreme Court, you shall issue this opinion. Well, we can't do that, and nor can the Supreme Court order us to pass a law. So, we went through this. It was really a terrible process, and frankly, for everybody involved in 21 and 22. We did our best to do what the Supreme Court said, and twice redrew our map and complied with their opinion. Then their map maker looked at it and said, we're still not going to elect enough leftist Democrats. Give them another order. Well, ultimately, again, once we got past all of that, everybody sat down at the table. Not everybody got what they want. including some not real happy Republicans in some of the bigger counties. But we ultimately got a map and unanimous bipartisan vote.
It's interesting to me that the only place you see the progressives and the leftists doing this kind of proposal are in red states. You don't see this in New York. You don't see this in New Jersey. You don't see this in other places.
California.
That ought to tell you more about what you are seeking, and what they're seeking is an outcome. They want an outcome. They really don't care how the process is to get them to that outcome, despite what they're going to say.
Yeah, in Maryland, for example, which is about a 60-40 Democrat-Republican state, they recently had a Republican governor, Larry Hogan. 7 out of their 8 congressional representatives are Democrats, which is 87% or so. The Republican Party in Maryland contacted Eric Holder and said, "We think we have some gerrymandering here. Can your group come in and sue for us?" And apparently their calls weren't returned. So this is about political power. It's about going to the places where they think that they can win. Because Ohio is a 50% plus 1 constitutional state. It's a big state with a lot of congressional seats. That's where they want to come in and spend their money.
If you have money, put yourself on the ballot.